The air in the apartment was always thick, a heavy blanket woven from old cooking smells and damp carpet. Tonight it was also laced with the sharp, sour scent of whiskey. It clung to Mark Jennings like a second skin, fueling the red flush that crept up his neck. His voice was a low growl that filled the small living room, a space already crowded with cheap furniture and years of unspoken disappointment. Sarah Carter stood by the peeling kitchen counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were white stars against her pale skin. She kept her eyes down, fixed on a crack in the linoleum, a tiny dark river leading nowhere. "I asked you a question," Mark said. The words were slurred, but the menace was perfectly clear. He took a step closer, and the floorboards groaned in protest. "Where is it?" "There is no more, Mark," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She risked a glance up at him. His eyes were bloodshot, narrowed into slits of pure frustration. "I gave you what was left yesterday, for the groceries. There's nothing. Don't lie to me." He wasn't shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was the quiet, simmering rage that came before the storm. He saw the world as a place that owed him something, and Sarah was the most convenient collection agent. "You always have something squirreled away. A little emergency fund." He made a grasping motion with his thick fingers. "Give it to me." "I swear there isn't," she pleaded, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fear. "It's all gone. We have to wait until Friday." His face darkened. Friday was an eternity. The names and faces of the men he owed money to swam behind his eyes, each one a promise of pain. His failure was a hot coal in his gut, and her calm, desperate denial was the wind that fanned it into a blaze. He saw her not as a partner, but as an obstacle, another locked door between him and what he needed. "Fine," he spat, the word cracking like a whip. "If there's nothing, then you're nothing." He moved fast. One hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm. Sarah flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. His grip was brutal, his fingers digging into the soft flesh. He didn't drag her. He propelled her, steering her across the worn rug towards the bedroom. Her feet stumbled, trying to keep up. It was a clumsy, horrifying dance she knew all too well. "Mark, please," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway, towards the other closed door. "Lily is sleeping." The mention of her daughter's name was a mistake. It was a reminder of another life, another responsibility he had failed to meet. It only hardened him. He shoved her through the bedroom doorway. She stumbled, catching herself on the unmade bed. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the weak city glow outside. It smelled of her, of lilac soap and faint anxiety. Before she could turn, before she could say another word, he slammed the door shut. The wood shuddered in its frame. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then came the sound she dreaded most. The metallic scrape of the key, followed by the decisive final click of the lock turning. Sarah pressed her ear against the door, her breath held tight in her chest. She heard his heavy footsteps moving away, followed by the creak of the sofa cushions as he sank into them. The television flickered on, a sudden burst of canned laughter that sounded obscene in the suffocating quiet of her new prison. Tears she had refused to shed in front of him now slid hot and silent down her cheeks. Her fear was a cold, familiar knot in her stomach, but it was secondary. A much sharper, more terrible anxiety gripped her. Lily, was she still asleep? Did she hear? Please let her have slept through it. Let her be safe in her dreams, worlds away from this waking nightmare. But Lily Carter was not asleep. She was wide awake, curled into a tight ball in the back of the hall closet. The space was her sanctuary, her tiny kingdom of darkness. It smelled of her mother's winter coat, a faint and reassuring scent of perfume and cold air. It smelled of cedar blocks in the dusty, sweet scent of old fabrics. Here she was small, here she was invisible. Her knees were pulled up to her chest and her arms were wrapped around them, making her body as compact as possible. She had learned the art of taking up no space at all. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She had been on her way to the bathroom when she heard his voice get low and dangerous. She had frozen, then scuttled into the closet without a sound, pulling the louvered door shut until only a sliver of hallway light remained. She had practiced this. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew how to breathe without making a sound. Pressed against her chest, held tight in her right hand, was her most treasured possession. A small, stuffed rabbit with floppy ears and fur, worn smooth from years of terrified clutching. One of its original black button eyes was missing, replaced by a slightly larger, mismatched brown one her mother had sewn on. Lily called him Patch. He had been a silent witness to every argument, every slammed door, every long, quiet night that followed. He absorbed her tears into his soft, worn body and never told a soul. Through the thin wood of the door, she had heard everything. Her mother's soft plea, his angry growl, the shove, and then the click. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the world. It echoed in the small, dark space, a sound of absolute finality. Mommy was trapped. He had locked Mommy in her room again. A sob caught in Lily's throat, hot and sharp. She buried her face in Patch's patched-up body to muffle the sound. Crying was dangerous. Sound was dangerous. But the image of her mother, alone in that dark room, was more than she could bear. Helplessness was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She was 7 years old, a tiny soldier in a war she could not fight. But tonight felt different. The anger in his voice had been sharper, the desperation in her mother softer. It was the silence now that scared her. The only sound was the muffled drone of the television from the living room. What was he doing? What if he fell asleep? What if he left Mommy in there all night? She needed water. She needed the bathroom. She needed to know Lily was okay. Lily's fingers, still pressed into the rabbit's side, brushed against something hard and rectangular in the pocket of her jeans. The phone. It was an old phone, a black plastic brick that her real dad had used years ago. After he was gone, her mom had let her keep it. It didn't work for calls anymore, the service long since disconnected. But it was a tangible piece of him, a connection to a time she barely remembered, a time of laughter in sunny parks. Sometimes late at night, she would turn it on just to look at the old pictures of a smiling man holding a baby. Her. Most of the time, she used it to play the one simple snake game it had. But there was one other thing she knew how to do. Her mother had shown her once, a long time ago, how to send a text message. She had helped Lily type a birthday message to Grandma, and there was one number in the phone's memory. Just one, labeled Dad. Lily knew the number by heart. In the lonely months after he was gone, she had sometimes dialed it, just to listen to the recorded voice on his voicemail, a warm and deep voice that said his name. Then one day the voicemail was gone, replaced by a cold, automated message saying the number was no longer in service. Still, she remembered the sequence of digits. It was the only number she knew in the entire world. A desperate, wild idea sparked in the darkness of the closet. A child's logic, pure and simple. A problem needed a solution. A cry for help needed to be sent. The phone was for sending messages. Her dad was her hero, the smiling man from the pictures who would have never let this happen. Maybe somehow if she sent the message to his number, he would get it. Maybe his ghost could hear. Or maybe, just maybe, someone else would. Her hands trembled as she pulled the phone from her pocket. The plastic was cool and worn. She held her breath and pressed the power button on the side. The small, pixelated screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow on her face and the hanging clothes around her. The light felt like a betrayal, a beacon in her safe darkness. She hunched over, shielding it with her body. She navigated the simple menu with her thumb, her movements clumsy with fear and urgency. Messages. New message. Her heart pounded as she carefully, deliberately typed in the 10 digits she had memorized like a prayer. The number of a man who was gone. Now, the words. What could she say? How could she explain the thick air and the locked door and the cold stone of fear in her stomach? She couldn't. She could only say what was happening. Her small thumbs hovered over the tiny keypad, pressing each button multiple times to get the right letter. HELOCKEDMOMMYIN, a space. Then the next words, a plea whispered into the digital void. PLEASEHELP. She read it over one more time. He locked Mommy in. Please help. It was small. It was simple. It was everything. Her thumb moved to the send button. For a moment, she hesitated. This felt huge, dangerous. A secret message sent out from her tiny, dark kingdom. But the image of her mother's face, pale and frightened, flashed in her mind. She pressed the button. A tiny icon of an envelope appeared on the screen, then a check mark. Message sent. Lily stared at the screen, her breath catching. It was done. She had done something. A tiny flare of hope, fragile as a spider's thread, flickered within her. She didn't know how it worked. She didn't know that the phone number of her deceased father had been deactivated, recycled, and reassigned just 3 weeks ago to a new anonymous SIM card. She didn't know her desperate prayer, typed in a dusty closet in a rundown building, was at that very moment flying across the city's invisible networks. She just squeezed her eyes shut, hugged Patch the rabbit, and wished with all her might, please, somebody, please help. Miles away, the city sprawled below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. The view was from the top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a needle of black glass and steel. Inside, there was no clutter. There was no dust. There was only silence, space, and the cold, clean scent of power. Black marble floors reflected the city lights in distorted, liquid patterns. The furniture was minimalist, sharp-angled chrome and dark, expensive leather. This was the penthouse of Julian Croft, a man known in the shadows of the city simply as the Ghost. Julian stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He wasn't admiring the view. He was observing his territory, a vast chessboard where he moved all the pieces. He was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was a study in control, all sharp lines and disciplined planes, marred only by a faint silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His gray eyes missed nothing. They saw arrangements, patterns, and liabilities. They did not see people. His empire was built on a foundation of fear, leverage, and absolute unforgiving efficiency. He was a surgeon in a world of butchers, his methods precise, quiet, and final. His solitude was as carefully constructed as his business dealings. Here in his sterile sanctuary high above the noise and chaos of the streets, he was untouchable. He was alone. He turned from the window and walked towards his desk, a vast slab of polished black marble that dominated the center of the room. On its surface, there were only three things: a sleek, modern laptop displaying stock tickers, the glass of whiskey he had just set down, and a small, ugly piece of plastic. It was a burner phone, a cheap, untraceable device he used for a single, specific line of communication, a line that was meant to be completely sterile and anonymous. It was a tool, nothing more. It was an anomaly in this world of bespoke suits and billion-dollar views, a grimy necessity of his trade. Suddenly, the profound silence of the penthouse was broken. It wasn't the polite, cultured chime of his personal smartphone. It was a harsh, grating buzz. The cheap plastic of the burner phone rattled against the cold, smooth marble, an insect-like sound that felt utterly alien in the tomb-like quiet. Julian's expression did not change. He looked at the phone with a flicker of annoyance. This line was for emergencies, for brief, coded reports from his most trusted inner circle. An unscheduled communication was an unwelcome deviation. He picked it up. The weight was negligible in his hand, a cheap toy. The small, backlit screen glowed with a new message. His cold gray eyes scanned the words, taking them in not as a plea, but as raw, unexpected data. The text was simple, riddled with the clumsy grammar of a child. He locked mommy in. Please help. Julian Croft stared at the pixelated words on the cheap plastic screen. The phone felt alien in his hand, a piece of street-level grit on the polished marble of his world. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a ghost of a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. He read the message a second time. He locked mommy in. Please help. The grammar was clumsy, the plea raw. It was absurd. It was pathetic. His first thought was that it was a prank, a clumsy attempt by a rival to sow confusion or get under his skin. Perhaps one of the Moretti brothers thinking themselves clever. They had been making noise lately, testing boundaries, and this felt like the kind of foolish, indirect needling they might try. It was a stupid, childish tactic, or more likely it was simply a wrong number. Some poor soul's domestic drama spilling over into his silent, ordered life. A digital cry for help that had lost its way and washed up on the wrong shore. In either case, it was an annoyance, a piece of static in the clean signal of his existence. He ran his empire in precision and control, and this was neither. It was messy, human, an unwelcome intrusion. The door to his office opened with a near-silent swing. Leo entered, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. He was dressed in a suit that was nearly as fine as Julian's, but he wore it like a uniform, not a second skin. Leo was the mechanism that made Julian's will a reality. He was the chief operating officer of an enterprise built on fear and whispers. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Julian didn't look up from the city lights that glittered like scattered jewels below. He tossed the burner phone across the vast expanse of black marble. Leo caught it with an easy practice motion, his eyes never leaving his boss. "Block this number," Julian said, his voice low and even. "It's a distraction." Leo glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. He saw the message, but no flicker of curiosity or concern crossed his face. It was simply data to be processed, a task to be completed. "Of course," Leo replied. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. "Will you want a trace?" Julian finally turned his gaze from the window, his gray eyes cold and flat. "Don't waste the resources. It's nothing." That was that. The problem was delegated, erased. Leo took a step forward, his posture shifting slightly. The brief interruption was over. It was time for business. "The situation at the docks is escalating," he began, his tone all professional efficiency. "The Morettis are no longer just observing. They approached 2 of our foremen yesterday. They weren't making suggestions. They were making offers." Julian leaned back in his leather chair, the material groaning softly. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on Leo. The docks were his. They were a vital artery, pumping goods, money, and influence into the heart of his operations. The Morettis were scavengers, picking at the edges of his territory for years. But this was different. This was a direct challenge. "And our foreman?" Julian asked. The question was quiet, but it held the weight of a death sentence. "Loyally," Leo answered immediately. "They reported it within the hour, but the offer was significant. The Morettis have a new source of capital." Julian's eyes narrowed. This was the real world. This was a problem he understood. It was a matter of leverage, pressure, and the calculated application of force. It had rules. It had a logical progression. Unlike the chaotic, emotional plea from the burner phone, this was a puzzle he could solve. "They've been making inroads with the Albanian syndicates," Julian mused, more to himself than to Leo. "New partners, new money, they feel bold." "They're becoming sloppy," Leo countered. "Making open plays like this, it gives us an opportunity to trim their ambition." Julian nodded slowly. Leo was right. An open move was a vulnerable move. "I want a full report on the Moretti's new financial arrangements. I want to know who they're borrowing from, who they're paying, and where every dollar is going. Find their new foundation, and we'll find the cracks in it." "It's already in motion," Leo confirmed. "We'll have a preliminary breakdown by morning." "Good," Julian said. "And send a message to our people at the docks. Double their hazard pay for the next month. Let them know loyalty is rewarded far more generously than treachery." It was a simple, elegant move, a show of strength and generosity that would solidify his position and make the Morettis' offers look cheap. Leo gave a single, sharp nod. He understood. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, a cold ballet of logistics and strategy. They discussed supply lines, political contacts, and the quiet removal of a minor player who had become a liability. Through it all, Julian was the ghost in the machine, a calm center of a violent storm directing every current and tide. When they were finished, Leo placed a thin data slate on the corner of the desk. "The preliminary financials for the quarter, sir." "Leave it," Julian said. Leo turned and walked out, closing the door as silently as he had entered. The burner phone was gone. The problem was solved. The silence of the penthouse descended once more, thick and absolute. Julian stood and walked to the wall of glass that served as his window to the world. He looked down at the city, a sprawling network of lights and lives, each one a story he would never know, a drama he would never witness. He was the architect of his own isolation, and he had built his fortress well. From up here, the city was beautiful and silent. The chaos, the noise, the desperation, it was all rendered into a serene, abstract pattern. He preferred it this way. He went to the bar, a minimalist structure of chrome and black granite. He opened a crystal decanter, the heavy stopper making a satisfying, solid sound as he set it down. He poured 2 fingers of a single malt scotch that cost more than most people's rent. The amber liquid swirled in the heavy glass. The routine was familiar, comforting. It was an anchor in his controlled reality. But tonight it felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was ringing. He took a sip of the scotch, letting the smoky peat coat his tongue, but the taste brought him no pleasure. The words from the phone drifted back into his mind, uninvited. He locked Mommy in. Please help. It was the word mommy that stuck, not mother or my mom. Mommy. It was the word of a small child, a child who was scared. He tried to dismiss it again. It was a stray signal, a meaningless fragment of someone else's miserable life. It had nothing to do with him. He had real problems. He had the Morettis, a multi-million-dollar enterprise to protect, a network of alliances to maintain. He dealt with men who understood violence as a tool of business, not the clumsy, pathetic rage of a domestic tyrant. This was beneath his notice. And yet, the words wouldn't leave. They echoed in the vast, empty space of his mind, a tiny, persistent voice cutting through the layers of cold calculation he had spent years building around himself. He walked back to his desk, the glass of whiskey cool in his hand. He had intended to review the financials Leo had left, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of numbers and projections. But his eyes were drawn to something else. On the far corner of the desk, away from the sleek monitors and data slates, sat a small, sterling silver frame. It was the only object in the entire penthouse that served no practical purpose. It was not for status, not for function. It was a relic. Inside the frame was a photograph, faded slightly with time. It was a picture of a young girl no older than 10. She had a wetty gap-toothed grin, her hair a messy tangle of brown curls. Her eyes were bright, full of a fierce, uncomplicated joy that Julian could barely remember feeling. In her arms, she clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its button eyes mismatched, its fur loved away in patches. He didn't look at the photo often. Most days it was just part of the landscape of his desk, an object he saw without truly seeing. But tonight his gaze locked onto it. He saw the girl's smile. He saw the trust in her eyes. He remembered the sound of her laughter, a sound that hadn't been heard in this world for a very, very long time. And as he stared at the ghost of that smile, the message from the burner phone surfaced again, overlaying the image in his mind. I'm scared. The 2 threads, the past and the present, the unknown child on the phone and the beloved girl in the frame, began to twist together. A cold feeling, colder than the ice in his drink, colder than the city air outside, began to uncoil in his stomach. It was a familiar feeling, though he had not allowed himself to feel it in over 2 decades. It was the feeling of a locked door, the feeling of shouting from the other side, the hollow, sickening feeling of helplessness, the feeling of being too late. He stood motionless, the expensive whiskey forgotten in his hand. His knuckles were white where he gripped the glass. His carefully constructed world, a world of power, order, and emotionless logic, was being threatened. Not by the Morettis, not by a rival syndicate, not by the law. It was being threatened by a text message from a child he didn't know, and a memory he could never escape. The message wasn't just static anymore. It was a summons, a call from a past he had buried under a mountain of wealth and power. The part of him that had failed so profoundly all those years ago, the boy who couldn't protect his own sister, was stirring in the man he had become. He looked from the photograph to the empty space on the desk where the burner phone had been. It was gone, but its presence lingered. It was no longer an annoyance. It was an accusation. He could feel a strange, unwelcome sense of responsibility settling over him, a weight he had not asked for and did not want. He could still hear the words, a faint whisper in the silent room. Please help. He couldn't shake the deep, resonant feeling of unease. The message was a stone dropped into the still, dark lake of his past, and he could feel the ripples spreading, waking something he had sworn to himself he would keep asleep forever. The air in the closet was thick with the smell of old wool and dust. Lily held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, trying to become invisible. Through the thin crack at the bottom of the door, a sliver of pale yellow light cut through the darkness. It was her only connection to the world outside, a world that was currently filled with the heavy, angry footsteps of Mark Jennings. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, its one-button eye staring blankly into the gloom. Her mother, Sarah, was in the bedroom. The click of the lock turning had been loud, a final metallic sound that echoed in the tiny apartment. Now there was only silence from that room. That silence was terrifying. But the noises from the living room were worse. Mark was pacing, back and forth, back and forth. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Lily could hear the sharp clink of a glass bottle against the coffee table. Then a low, guttural curse. He was angry. He was always angry after he came back from wherever he went, smelling of stale beer and failure. He had wanted money. Sarah had said there was none left. That was when he had shoved her into the bedroom. Lily's own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet of her hiding place. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of the door, listening. A heavy thud shook the wall beside her. Sarah. Lily flinched, pulling the rabbit tighter against her chest. It was followed by a sharp, splintering crash. Wood. He had thrown something, maybe the little wooden chair from the corner. Another crash, this time the unmistakable musical shatter of glass. The lamp, the one with the faded floral shade that Sarah loved. Tears pricked at the corners of Lily's eyes. He was breaking their home. He was breaking her mother's things. Each sound was a punch, a violation that made the small space of the closet feel like it was shrinking around her. She squeezed her eyes shut. The first message had not worked. She had waited, watching the tiny screen of the old phone, praying for a reply that never came. Maybe the words weren't right. Maybe she hadn't explained it properly. Maybe the person on the other end thought it was a game. This was not a game. This was real. The sound of a drawer being ripped from a dresser and its contents spilling onto the floor jolted her. A new wave of fear, sharp and cold, washed over her. He was getting angrier, louder, more destructive. She had to try again. She had to make them understand. Her small fingers, trembling and slick with sweat, fumbled with the phone. The dim light from the screen illuminated her face, a pale, frightened oval in the darkness. She navigated back to the message thread. The single outgoing text sat there, unanswered. He locked Mommy in. Please help. It looked so small now, so insufficient. She needed more words, better words. With a surge of desperate resolve, she began to type. Her thumbs were clumsy, hitting the wrong keys. She deleted the mistakes and started over, her breath catching in her throat with every new sound from the living room. Finally, the message was ready. It was simple. It was the truest thing she knew. Please, he's breaking things. I'm scared. She stared at the last two words. I'm scared. It felt like pulling a secret from the deepest part of her heart and putting it on the screen. It was an admission of the terror that had been her constant companion for so long. She hesitated for only a second. Then her thumb pressed down hard on the send button. The word sent appeared below the text. She watched it as if her gaze alone could force it through the air and into the hands of someone who could help. Then she turned the screen off to save the battery and sank back into the darkness, listening to the symphony of destruction outside her door. Miles away, the city glittered like a field of scattered diamonds. From his penthouse, Julian Croft saw it not as a collection of lives and stories, but as a map of his domain. Each light was a data point, each district a territory. The silence in the room was absolute, a manufactured piece he curated as carefully as his business holdings. The whiskey in his glass was old and smooth, the crystal cool against his fingers. The unease from earlier, sparked by that first strange message, had faded into a low, background hum. He had dismissed it. Leo was handling it. It was nothing. A loose thread in a world of tightly woven control. He preferred to focus on the more significant threats, the rival crews, the shifting alliances. Then, A sound violated the perfect quiet. It was not the sophisticated, muted chime of his personal phone. It was a cheap, jarring buzz, an electronic insect skittering across the polished surface of his marble desk. The burner phone. He stared at it. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He had explicitly told Leo to block the number. Incompetence was a flaw he did not tolerate, not even in his most trusted man. His first instinct was to sweep the device off the desk and let it shatter on the floor below. It was an anomaly, an unwelcome piece of static in his clean, orderly world. But he did not. The buzzing stopped, leaving a silence that now felt charged, expectant. The phone lay there, a cheap piece of black plastic on a slab of stone, worth more than the building it had been sent from. The memory of the first message returned. He locked Mommy in. It was absurd, a child's game, a wrong number of epic proportions. Yet it had left a small, cold splinter in his mind. He had seen the image of his sister's face in the silver frame, and for a moment the world had tilted. Now this second buzz felt less like an accident and more like an insistence, a demand. With a sigh of profound annoyance, he reached across the desk and picked up the phone. It felt light and flimsy in his hand, a toy. He pressed the button to wake the screen. The pixelated display glowed to life, showing one new message from the same unknown number. He read the words, and the world fell away. Please, he's breaking things. I'm scared. It was not the plea for help that struck him first. It was not the report of destruction. It was the final two words. I'm scared. The phrase was unadorned. It was not dramatic or manipulative. It was the simple, raw, and undeniable terror of a child. It cut through the layers of cynicism and detachment he had spent decades building. It bypassed the cold logic of the businessman and the ruthless calculus of the crime lord. It went straight into that locked, forgotten room in his soul where his own past failures were stored. He could almost hear it in a different voice, a voice from 20 years ago, thin and trembling over a bad phone connection. He's crazy, Julian. I'm scared. He had told her to be strong. He had told her he would handle it in the morning. He had underestimated the man's rage. He had been too logical. He had been too slow. He had been too late. The next call he received was not from his sister, but from a tired police officer offering condolences. The glass of whiskey on his desk was forgotten. The panoramic view of his city disappeared. His entire universe narrowed to the small, glowing screen in his hand. The letter seemed to burn into his vision. I'm scared. This was not a prank. Pranksters were clever or foolish or cruel. They were not this. This was genuine. He could feel the authenticity of it like a physical force, a desperate signal flaring up from somewhere deep in the city's concrete canyons. The first message had been a question mark. This one was an exclamation point, an alarm bell that only he could hear. His grip tightened on the phone, the cheap plastic creaking under the pressure. The unease he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by something else entirely. It was a cold, heavy certainty, a feeling that he was standing at a crossroads he did not ask for, but which he could not turn away from. To ignore this now, to block the number and go back to his whiskey, would not be a passive act. It would be a choice. It would be a deliberate decision to turn his back. It would be the same as hearing his sister's voice again and choosing to hang up the phone. He slowly raised his head, his gray eyes no longer looking at the city, but through it. He saw a cramped apartment. He saw a locked door. He saw a terrified child hiding in the dark. The image was so vivid it felt like a memory. The carefully constructed walls around his heart did not just crack, they fractured. The ghost of his past was no longer a whisper. It was a shout demanding action. It was telling him that the world had, for some unknowable reason, offered him a second chance. A chance to answer a different call. A chance not to be too late. The air in the penthouse seemed to crackle with his stillness. All the power, all the wealth, all the fear he commanded, it all felt hollow in the face of those two small words. For years, his strength had been for building an empire, for holding territory, for instilling order through fear. Now, a child's terror was asking what it was all for. What good was being a king if you let the most vulnerable of your subjects perish? The thought was unwelcome, disruptive, and utterly undeniable. The plea had found him. It had been aimed at a dead man, but it had found the part of Julian Croft that had died 20 years ago, and it was bringing it back to life. He lowered the phone, his face a mask of cold resolve. The internal debate was over. Logic had lost. Annoyance had evaporated. All that remained was a grim, unyielding purpose. He would not stand by. He could not. The machinery of his organization, a tool of violence and profit, would now be turned to a new singular task. He did not know the name. He did not know the face. But he knew the fear, and he was going to extinguish it. Julian clenched his jaw, the decision to ignore the plea no longer an option. The silence in the penthouse shattered, not with a sound, but with a movement. Julian Croft pushed himself up from his leather chair. The motion was fluid, economical, yet it sent a ripple of tension through the vast, empty room. The heavy crystal glass of whiskey sat untouched on the marble desk, its amber contents catching the cold city lights. He had made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The choice to ignore the plea was no longer his to make. It had been taken from him by the ghost of a memory and the terrified words of a child. He turned, the burner phone held loosely in his hand. Its cheap plastic felt alien against his skin, a grubby artifact in a world of polished chrome and flawless design. He raised his voice just enough to cut through the oppressive quiet of the top floor. Leo. The name was not a shout, it was a summons, sharp and absolute, a command that expected and received immediate obedience. Seconds later, his right-hand man appeared in the doorway of the main living area. Leo was a man built for the shadows Julian cast. Dressed in a simple, dark suit that was expensive but unremarkable, he had a calm, unassuming face that made him instantly forgettable. It was his greatest asset. He saw Julian standing by the desk, saw the burner phone, and his expression remained neutral. He was accustomed to late-night emergencies, to cryptic problems that needed solving before the sun rose. He assumed this was another piece of business, another rival to be dealt with, another complication in their intricate web of control. Julian did not offer an explanation. He simply extended his hand, holding out the small black phone. "Find them," he said. His voice was unnervingly low, stripped of all emotion except a chilling, focused intensity. "Now." Leo took the phone. He glanced at the screen, his eyes quickly scanning the two messages. He locked Mommy in. "Please help." Then, "Please, he's breaking things. I'm scared." A flicker of confusion crossed his features, so brief it was almost imperceptible. This was not the language of their world. It was not a threat from a rival or a tip from an informant. It was something raw, something domestic and desperate. He looked up at Julian, his gaze searching for context, for the angle he was missing. Was this a code? A new kind of trap? But Julian's face was a mask of stone. His gray eyes were fixed on some point beyond Leo, beyond the walls of the penthouse, focused on a target only he could see. The cold fury emanating from him was palpable. Leo knew better than to ask who they were or why the most powerful man in the city's underworld was concerned with a frightened child. The why was irrelevant. The how was his job. "Right away," Leo said, his voice a quiet murmur of assent. He turned without another word and walked towards the section of the wall that looked like a seamless panel of dark, polished wood. He pressed a specific spot, and a portion of the wall slid back silently, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside was not a safe or a weapons cache, but a compact, state-of-the-art command center. A bank of monitors glowed with a soft blue light, currently displaying silent financial data and security feeds from across the city. Leo sat in a sleek chair and gently placed the burner phone into a cradle connected to the system. His fingers began to move across a keyboard, the soft clicking the only sound in the room. Lines of code scrolled rapidly down one of the screens. Julian remained standing, a silent, imposing statue watching the process unfold. He did not pace, he did not fidget. His stillness was more menacing than any overt display of anger. It was the stillness of a predator, coiled and ready to strike. His mind, however, was far from still. The words, "he's breaking things," echoed in his head. They had unlocked a door he kept bolted shut, a door that led to a dim, narrow hallway in a house that no longer existed. He could almost smell the stale cigarette smoke and cheap perfume. He could almost hear the sudden, sharp crack of a dinner plate shattering against a wall. He remembered the sound of his mother's stifled sob. He remembered the high, thin wail of his little sister, Sarah, not the Sarah Carter in some unknown apartment, but his own. The memory was a physical sensation, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He had been a boy then, powerless, hiding in his room, listening to the sounds of a rage he could not stop. He was not boy anymore. "The phone is a ghost," Leo reported, his eyes glued to the screen. "Untraceable SIM, no registered owner. The number was recycled just 3 weeks ago. It belonged to a man named David Carter, deceased, car accident 6 months back." The name hung in the air. Carter. Julian's jaw tightened. It was a thread, a fragile connection. "The signal," Julian said, his voice flat. "Where is it coming from?" "Triangulating," Leo replied. On the central monitor, a map of the city appeared. It was a living, breathing diagram of light and data. A red pulse emanated from 3 different points on the map, representing the cell towers that had picked up the phone's signal. Lines shot out from each pulse, converging, narrowing down the search area. The vast cityscape shrank, the focus tightening from a sprawling metropolis to a specific borough, then to a neighborhood. The algorithm worked with terrifying speed, cross-referencing signal strength and delay times. "The signal is weak, but it's steady. They're not moving." The map zoomed in further, resolving into a grid of streets Julian knew but never visited. This was not the gleaming heart of the city where he resided. It was the forgotten periphery, a district of low-rise brick buildings, neglected parks, and corner stores with metal grates over their windows. It was a place where people lived paycheck to paycheck, where sirens were a common part of the nightly soundtrack, a place where monsters could thrive behind closed doors, unnoticed and unopposed. "I have it," Leo announced. The 3 lines had merged into a single, blinking red dot. "Block 477 on the corner of Oak Street and Elm Avenue. The signal is originating from a 5-story apartment building." The red dot pulsed over the building's schematic. "It's a dense area." "What going that area? The signal could be coming from any of 20 units. "Not good enough," Julian said. "Oh." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. Leo did not flinch. He was already working. A new window opened on his screen, a simple text interface. His fingers danced across the keys, inputting a series of commands that Julian knew were highly illegal. He was slicing through firewalls, accessing private servers. First, the city's power utility. He isolated the building and pulled the records for every tenant. Then, telecommunications. Then, rental agreements from the property management company's insecure server. A list of names populated the screen. Julian walked over to stand behind Leo, his cold gaze scanning the list. Miller, Rodriguez, Chen. The names meant nothing. He felt a surge of raw, primal impatience. Every second that passed was another second the child was in that room, listening to the sounds of breaking things. He could feel her terror as if it were his own, a cold sweat on the back of his neck. Leo's finger traced down the screen. "Here, Dipon," he said, his voice tight with discovery. He highlighted a name. Apartment 2B. Tenant name it is Sarah Carter. One dependent listed. Lily Carter, age 7. He paused, then added, "She moved in 4 months ago. The lease is co-signed by a Mark Jennings." Sarah and Lily Carter. The names fit the story perfectly. The deceased father's phone now in the hands of his child. The new man, Jennings, who brought violence into their home. The entire grim, pathetic story laid bare in a few lines of data. Leo looked up at Julian, a silent question in his eyes. He had found them. He had done his part. Now came the part he could not predict. What was Julian going to do with this information? Call the police? Send a warning? This was not their business. It was messy. It was personal. Julian stared at the address on the screen. 2B 477 Oak Street. It was no longer an abstract location on a map. It was a destination. It was a promise. The image of his own sister's face, pale and small in a silver frame on his desk, flashed in his mind. The police officer's words from so long ago echoed with perfect clarity. "We're sorry, son. We were too late." He would not be too late, not this time. The world could spin on, its business conducted, its deals made, its territories fought over. But for tonight, all of that was meaningless. His entire empire, his wealth, his power, all the fear he commanded, it all suddenly had a single solitary purpose. He turned away from the glowing screens, his decision absolute. He walked back towards his desk, but not to sit down. He shrugged off the jacket of his expensive suit, letting it fall onto the chair. He moved towards the wardrobe, his steps measured and deliberate. From it, he pulled a Wuthong dark wool coat, the kind of coat meant for standing on a windswept pier in the dead of winter. It was practical, heavy, and devoid of style. It was a piece of his old life, a life before penthouses and custom suits. As Julian shrugged on the coat, its familiar weight settling on his shoulders, Leo began to read the address aloud from the screen. His voice was a steady, professional drone, a stark contrast to the storm gathering in Julian's eyes. Apartment 2B, 477 Oak Street, corner of Elm. Julian's face was a mask of cold fury, his features carved from ice. He was no longer Julian Croft, the untouchable businessman. He was something older, something far more dangerous. He was a promise being kept, a debt being paid. He was on his way. The black sedan moved like a phantom through the city's veins. Its engine was a low, unobtrusive hum, a sound swallowed by the insulated cabin. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of expensive leather and Julian's own quiet fury. He sat in the back, his posture perfect, his hands resting on his knees. Leo was in the passenger seat, a silent statue staring straight ahead, respecting the storm he could feel gathering beside him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the mission itself did not already scream. Outside the tinted windows, the heart of the metropolis glittered. Towers of glass and steel scraped the night sky, their lights a cold, distant constellation. It was Julian's city. He owned the view from every one of those penthouses, controlled the commerce in the streets below, held the fear of its inhabitants in his gloved hands. It was a kingdom built of shadows and whispers, a monument to absolute control. He watched the lights blur into streaks of gold and white as the car picked up speed, heading east. The opulence began to bleed away, block by block. The towers shrank, replaced by brick buildings with darkened windows. The golden glow of high-end retail gave way to the aggressive, flickering neon of liquor stores and bail bondsmen. They were crossing a border into another world, a world he knew existed but had not set foot in for over 20 years. A world of thin walls and cheaper lives, where desperation was the common currency. A world he had escaped, that he had sworn to crush under the heel of his ambition so that it could never touch him again. Yet here he was, racing back into its shabby embrace because of 2 short messages from a frightened child. The words from the burner phone were seared into his mind. He locked Mommy in. Please help. And then the second one, more frantic, more naked in its terror. Please, he's breaking things. I'm scared. He had built an empire to shield himself from such raw, pathetic vulnerability. His life was a fortress of calculated risks and emotionless transactions. He did not help. He acquired, he eliminated, he controlled. Helping was a messy, unpredictable business. It was a fool's game. And yet, his gaze drifted from the passing decay of the suburbs and focused on his own reflection in the dark glass. The face staring back was a mask of discipline. Cold gray eyes, a jaw set like granite, not a flicker of the tempest raging inside. But he could feel it, an old, familiar coldness creeping up his spine, a feeling he had not truly felt since he was a young man, full of useless fire and no real power. The coldness of helplessness. The reflection in the window seemed to shimmer, the lines of his face softening, the flecks of gray at his temples vanishing. The tailored suit melted away, replaced by a cheap leather jacket, soaked through with rain. The scent of the car's interior was gone, replaced by the smell of wet asphalt in something acrid like burnt plastic. The hum of the engine became the rhythmic, maddening sweep of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against a downpour. He wasn't in the sedan anymore. He was 22 years old, standing on a cracked pavement in a neighborhood just like this one. Red and blue lights painted the street in garish, silent flashes, reflecting off the slick, wet surfaces of police cars and an ambulance parked haphazardly at the curb. Yellow tape, stark and obscene, cordoned off a small, sad-looking house with peeling paint and a single light on in an upstairs window. He had run 3 blocks from the bus stop after his brother-in-law Thomas had called him, his voice a drunken, slurring mess of excuses and blame. There was an accident, Julian. A stupid accident. He had dropped the phone and just ran, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Now, a police officer, a man whose face was weary and impassive, stood in front of him, blocking his path. The man's raincoat dripped steadily onto the pavement. "You can't go in there, son," the officer said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "That's my sister's house," Julian had said, his own voice sounding thin and young to his ears. "Anna, is she okay? Her husband called me. He said there was an accident." He could feel the lie of that word even as he spoke it. It had never been an accident with Thomas. It was always a slow, deliberate demolition. The officer looked at him, then glanced back at the house, a flicker of something. Maybe pity, crossing his features for a bare second. "Your sister is Anna Croft?" "Anna Jennings now," Julian corrected, the name tasting like poison. He remembered the day she had told him she was taking Thomas's name, the pride in her voice, the hope. He had seen the darkness in Thomas then, but she had been blinded by a desperate need to be loved. The officer sighed, a plume of white vapor in the cold night air. He looked back at Julian, his eyes holding a kind of practiced, tired sorrow. He had delivered this news before, many times. "I'm sorry, son," he began, and Julian's entire world began to tilt on its axis. He knew what came after those words. Paramedics arrived about 20 minutes ago. There was nothing they could do. The rain fell harder. The flashing lights seemed to pulse in time with the roaring in Julian's ears. He stared at the officer, uncomprehending. The man's mouth was moving, but the sounds were distorted, muffled by the sudden, deafening silence in his own head. "Dispute seems to have escalated." Nothing they could do. "Found at the bottom of the stairs." "A stupid accident." "Your brother-in-law is in custody." The words finally broke through the noise. "What do you mean there was nothing they could do?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. He felt a desperate, childish urge to push past the man, to run inside and see for himself. To prove this tired, indifferent stranger wrong. Anna was strong. She was a survivor. She would be sitting in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea, waiting for him. The officer's expression hardened slightly, the professional mask slipping back into place. "Your sister is deceased, son. I'm very sorry. We were too late." Too late. The 2 words hit him not like a punch, but like a shard of ice lodging itself deep in his chest. Too late. He who had promised her he would always protect her. He who had seen the bruises she tried to hide and heard the fear she tried to laugh away. He had told her to leave Thomas 100 times. He had offered her money, a place to stay. But he had not forced the issue. He had respected her choices, her misplaced hope that Thomas would change. He had not wanted to overstep. And now she was gone. He remembered standing there in the rain for what felt like hours, long after the officer had moved away to talk into his radio. He just stared at the house, stared at the yellow tape that separated his world from hers. He was powerless, a spectator to the wreckage of his own family. All the anger, all the ambition brewing inside him, it was all useless. It could not turn back time. It could not breach that yellow tape. It could not make his sister breathe again. The coldness that settled in his bones that night never truly left. It became the foundation upon which he built everything. Power was not about money or influence. It was about never ever being too late again. It was about having the strength to tear down the walls, to break through the door, to ignore the polite boundaries and rip the thread out by its roots before it had a chance to bloom. He had spent the next 2 decades ensuring that no one could ever tell him he was powerless again. He had become the one who decided who was too late. The screech of a distant siren pulled him from the depths of the memory. The image of the rain-slicked street dissolved, and his own reflection sharpened in the window once more. The face of the hardened man he was now. The car was slowing, turning off the main thoroughfare and onto a quieter, darker street lined with identical, grim-looking apartment blocks. The air in the car still smelled of leather, but Julian could almost taste the rain and regret from that night 20 years ago. The old, cold feeling of helplessness was still there, a frozen core deep inside him. But now it was wrapped in something else, something hot and potent. A white-hot, focused rage. That night his anger had been a wild, useless fire, consuming only himself. Tonight it had a target, a direction. He looked at Leo, who had remained perfectly still the entire time. Leo met his gaze in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, but his understanding absolute. He knew this was different. This wasn't business. This was something far more elemental. "We're 2 blocks away," Leo said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. Julian gave a curt nod. He looked out the window at the building they were approaching. It was just as sad and defeated as the house from his memory. Faded brick, rusting fire escapes, windows like vacant eyes. In one of those boxes, a man was breaking things. A woman was locked away, and a little girl was hiding, clutching a phone, terrified. It was the same story, the same ugly, pathetic drama playing out in a different cheap room. But the ending would be different. He was not the powerless young man standing in the rain anymore. He was Julian Croft. And he was not a spectator. He pictured the flimsy door to that apartment. He pictured the man behind it, a bully drunk on his own petty power, terrorizing the weak because he was too cowardly to face the strong. The image of his sister's hopeful face flashed in his mind, quickly followed by the officer's empty words. "Too late." The phrase echoed, not as a statement of fact, but as a challenge, a dare. A primal vow rose up from that icy core within him, hot as molten steel. This time there would be no yellow tape he could not cross. There would be no officer to tell him it was over. He would be the one to end it. He would not fail another one. Not again. His hand moved from his knee to the plush leather armrest beside him. He gripped it, his fingers tightening until the fine stitching strained under the pressure. The blood drained from his hand, his knuckles turning a stark, bone white against the dark material. This time he would not be too late. The smooth leather of the seat was cold against Julian's back. Outside the tinted windows, the city's glittering spine dissolved. The gleaming towers of commerce and power, his towers, bled away into a forgotten landscape of low-slung brick and tired concrete. Streetlights grew dimmer here, casting a sickly yellow glow that seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than pushing it back. The sedan, a black phantom of wealth and precision, moved silently through streets that had given up. Its quiet hum was an alien sound in a place that buzzed with the low frequency of struggle. Leo drove with practiced stillness, his eyes on the road, but Julian could feel his second-in-command's unease. It was a subtle tension in the air, a tightening in the quiet of the car. They had left a world of calculated risks and surgical violence for something messy, something unpredictable. This was not a business transaction. It was not an acquisition or a territory dispute. It was a descent. Julian stared out at the passing buildings. They were scarred with graffiti and neglect, their windows like vacant eyes. In one, a single blue light flickered, the lonely glow of a television screen. Who lived there? What small dramas were playing out behind those thin walls? For the first time in years, he was noticing. He was seeing the city not as a map of his influence, but as a collection of fragile lives. The memory of his sister was no longer a flicker. It sat beside him in the passenger seat, a cold, heavy presence. He remembered the phone call not from her, but from a neighbor. He remembered the drive, a frantic, desperate race against a clock he couldn't see. He remembered the nauseating mix of hope and dread that had churned in his gut. Hope that it was all a misunderstanding. Dread that it was exactly what he feared. The streets had looked like this then too, full of shadows and a quiet despair that promised to swallow you whole. He had been young, powerless, a boy trying to do a man's job. Now he was no longer that boy. He was the city's ghost, a man whose power was absolute, a force that bent the world to his will. And still the same cold dread was coiling in his stomach. "We are here," Leo said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Julian heard the undertone. "This is a mistake." The car eased to a stop before a building that seemed to be actively crumbling. It was a 3-story block of faded brown brick, its face pocked with patches of mismatched mortar, like old clumsy stitches on a wound. A fire escape clung to its side, rusted and skeletal. Garbage cans overflowed near the entrance, a sour, damp smell seeping into the night air even before the doors opened. This was not just a building. It was a monument to defeat. It was the kind of place people ended up in, not where they started. Julian's hand rested on the door handle. The polished chrome was a strange, alien object in this setting. It was a piece of his world, about to make contact with theirs. He pushed the door open, and the sounds of the night rushed in, overwhelming the car's sterile silence. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A distant siren wailed, a constant, mournful song in these parts of the city. And then, another sound, a sound that cut through everything else. It was faint, carried on the cold wind from an open window on the second floor. A man's voice, thick with rage, shouting words that were indistinct but carried the unmistakable weight of violence. It was followed by a different sound, the splintering crack of something breaking. Then a woman's cry, not a scream of terror, but a choked, weary sob of pain and resignation. Julian froze, his hand still on the car door. That sound. It was the sound he had heard through the splintered wood of his sister's front door all those years ago. The sound of a man's fury and a woman's fear. The sound of a life being broken in a small, forgotten room. The ghost of his past failure rose up and wrapped its cold fingers around his heart. The rage that had been simmering inside him for the last hour ignited. It was a clean, white-hot fire now, burning away the last traces of the detached, calculating man he was supposed to be. Leo got out of the driver's side, his movements sharp and alert. He surveyed the street, the building, the dark windows. His mind was a calculator, adding up risks and variables. An unknown assailant, a domestic dispute, potential witnesses, the police. This was a tactical nightmare, a quagmire of civilian problems that had no place in their world. He walked around the front of the car, his expensive shoes crunching softly on loose gravel and broken glass. He stopped beside Julian, his presence a silent wall of caution. "Julian," he began, his voice a low murmur, meant only for his boss. "This is not our fight. We don't operate like this." The shouting from the window grew louder, a string of slurred curses. It was followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting a wall. Sarah's cry was sharper this time, a spike of raw pain. For Julian, it was like a physical blow. He could feel it in his own chest, an echo of a helplessness he had sworn he would never feel again. "We make an anonymous call," Leo pressed, his voice urgent but controlled. "We report a disturbance. The police will come. They will handle it. We will be gone. No trace, no connection. It is the clean way, the smart way." He was right, of course. Leo was always right. It was why he was Julian's right hand, his consigliere. He saw the world as a chessboard, and his every move was designed to protect the king. Calling the authorities was the logical move. It removed them from the equation. It insulated Julian from the messy, unpredictable fallout of a street-level brawl. It was how the ghost would handle it. But Julian was not the ghost right now. He was the brother who had arrived too late. He was the boy who had stood on a porch and listened to the police tell him there was nothing more they could do. The police, the system, the proper channels. They were a machine that moved at its own pace, a slow, grinding bureaucracy that arrived in time to draw chalk outlines and fill out reports. They did not move with the urgency of a beating heart. They did not understand that every second that passed was another scar, another fracture, another piece of a soul being chipped away. He had relied on them once and they had failed. He would not make that mistake a second time. Leo saw the shift in Julian's posture, the rigid set of his shoulders. He reached out and placed a hand on Julian's arm. It was a familiar gesture, one he had used a dozen times before a difficult negotiation or a tense meeting. It was a gesture of grounding, of counsel, a reminder of who they were and the rules they lived by. "Boss," Leo said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a rare thread of genuine concern. "Think about this. Think of the exposure. A man like you found in a place like this, it creates questions we cannot answer. It puts everything at risk. For what? A wrong number? A domestic squabble between strangers? The word strangers hung in the air between them. To Leo, that's all they were. A nameless, faceless woman and child. A data point in a city of millions. An anomaly. But to Julian, they were not strangers. The little girl's words were etched into his mind. I'm scared. It was the same fear he had seen in his sister's eyes in the weeks before she died. The same fear he had been too young and too weak to erase. This was not about strangers. This was a debt. An old, cold debt that had come due. Julian slowly turned his head. He did not shrug off Leo's hand. He did not speak. He simply looked at him. It was not a look of anger. Anger was a hot, loud emotion. This was something else entirely. It was a look of absolute, chilling finality. His gray eyes, usually cold and assessing, were now like chips of granite. They held the stillness of a frozen lake, and beneath the surface, a terrifying depth. The look stripped away 20 years of shared history, of loyalty, of brotherhood. It dissolved the roles of boss and consigliere, leaving only one thing in its place, an unshakable, unmovable will. In that one look, Julian communicated everything. Your counsel is not requested. Your permission is not required. Your caution is irrelevant. You will not stop me. Leo's hand fell from Julian's arm as if it had been burned. The color drained from his face. He was a man who had faced down rival crews, stared into the barrels of guns, and negotiated deals with the most ruthless criminals in the city. He had never once flinched, but he flinched now. He took a small, involuntary step back. He had just looked into the eyes of the man behind the legend, the true source of the fear that Julian Croft commanded, and it was more terrifying than any myth. He had seen a man who would burn down his own empire to see this one thing through. He opened his mouth to say something else, anything, but the words died in his throat. He simply nodded, a single sharp gesture of submission. The debate was over. Julian turned away from him, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the decrepit building, the peeling paint on the door, the rusted handle, the grime-caked window beside it. Every detail sharpened, pulling into focus. The sounds from the second floor had faded into a low murmur, the angry shouting replaced by a heavy, menacing silence that was somehow worse. It was the quiet after the storm, the pause before the next wave of violence. Time was running out. He did not look back at Leo. He did not look at the sleek black car that represented his power and his prison. He had stepped out of that world the moment he opened the door. He was on foot now, on the cracked pavement of a forgotten street, moving toward a sound that only he could truly hear. It was the echo of a promise he had made to himself over a sister's grave, a vow that if he ever had the power, he would never be too late again. Ignoring his consigliere, who stood frozen by the car like a statue, Julian strode toward the building's entrance. His purpose was absolute. Each step was heavy, deliberate, a hammer blow against the pavement. He was no longer a mafia boss moving to protect an asset. He was a force of nature moving to correct an imbalance in the universe. And heaven helped the man who stood in his way. He did not run. His pace was measured, deliberate, as he pushed through the flimsy front door of the building. The air that hit him was thick and stagnant. It smelled of boiled cabbage, damp concrete, and something sour, like old garbage left too long. A single fluorescent tube flickered overhead in the narrow lobby, casting a sickly yellow light on the grimy, scuffed walls. Mailboxes were dented, some hanging open like broken teeth. This was not just a building. It was a place of quiet desperation, a container for lives lived on the edge. Leo was a step behind him, his presence a silent question, a bubble of professional concern in the suffocating atmosphere. Julian ignored him. He was no longer in his penthouse looking down on the city. He was in it, breathing its worst air, walking its forgotten floors. The stairs were to the left, covered in cracked and peeling linoleum that squelched softly under his expensive leather shoes. The sound was obscene in the silence. It was the only sound besides the distant, muffled thumping from somewhere above. He placed a gloved hand on the rickety wooden banister. It was sticky. He felt the grain of the wood through the thin material, a splintered, rough surface that spoke of years of neglect. Every step upward was a descent into a world he had long ago escaped, a world he had built an empire to never see again. But the thumping continued, a rhythmic, angry punctuation mark in the quiet. It was followed by the faint, high-pitched wail of a child's cry. The sound acted like a key in a lock, turning something cold and rusted deep inside his chest. It was not his sister's cry. He knew that. But it was a cry from the same place of terror, the same feeling of being small and helpless while the world was large and violent. The cold fury that had been a low hum in the car began to sharpen, honing itself to a fine, piercing point. His breathing was even. His face was a mask of placid stone. But inside, a storm was gathering, the kind that leveled city blocks and ended bloodlines. He was not Julian Croft, the businessman, the untouchable ghost of the underworld. He was just a brother who had arrived too late, and he would burn the world down before he was too late again. Leo spoke his name, a low murmur, a caution, a plea to reconsider, to think, to use the tools they always used: influence, distance, plausible deniability. But those tools were for a different kind of war. This was not a war. This was an exorcism. Julian reached the second-floor landing. The linoleum here was even worse, worn through to the dark subfloor in patches. The air was warmer, thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. The shouting was louder now, a man's voice, slurred and furious. It came from behind the door marked 2B. "You think you can hide from me? You think that little brat can protect you?" The voice was a guttural roar, followed by a heavy crash. It sounded like glass shattering. Then came the child's cry again, sharper this time, a pure note of undiluted fear. Julian stopped. He stood before the door. It was painted a drab, faded brown, the paint chipped around the lock and the cheap brass-colored handle. A small, cloudy peephole stared out like a dead eye. He could hear the man's heavy, pacing footsteps inside. He could hear the child's desperate, hiccuping sobs. He did not need to see. He had seen this scene before, in his nightmares for 20 years. Leo moved to stand beside him, ready to pick the lock or find a more subtle entry. He reached into his coat, his movements fluid and practiced. Julian raised a single hand, a gesture that stopped his most trusted man cold. There would be no subtlety. There would be no quiet entry. Subtlety was a form of respect for the barrier between two worlds. This door, this man, this room deserved no respect. He was not here to negotiate or to intimidate. He was here to shatter, to break the frame of this ugly picture so that it could never be put back together again. He took a half step back, planting his left foot firmly on the worn floor. He raised his right leg, his body coiling like a spring, all the power of his large frame focused into a single point. He did not think about the rivals he had crushed, the deals he had made, the empire he commanded. He thought of a little girl hiding in a closet. He thought of a message sent into the void. He thought of a promise he had made to a ghost. And he brought his foot forward. The impact was not a kick. It was an explosion. The sound was deafening in the narrow hall, a sharp, violent crack of splintering wood that echoed like a gunshot. The cheap particle board door did not splinter. It disintegrated. The entire locking mechanism, the deadbolt, the handle, everything tore free from the frame in a shower of wooden shards and metal dust. The door itself flew inward, ripping from its very hinges as if it were made of paper, and crashed against an inside wall with a sickening thud. For a moment, dust and debris hung in the air, illuminated by the dim yellow light from within the apartment. A profound, shocked silence fell, replacing the shouting and the crying, and then the scene resolved itself. Julian stood in the gaping hole where the door used to be, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. His suit was immaculate. His posture was perfectly still. His eyes, cold and gray, swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance. The apartment was a disaster. An overturned table, a shattered lamp, broken plates on the floor. The air stank of alcohol and rage. And in the center of the chaos stood Mark Jennings. He was a large man, gone to seed. His face was flushed red, his eyes weak and uncomprehending. A half-empty bottle of whiskey was clutched in his hand. He had been in the middle of a bellowing rant, his body turned towards the corner of the room. Julian's gaze followed Mark's. There, huddled on the floor between a grubby sofa and the wall, was a small child. It was Lily. She was tiny, a crumpled ball of pink pajamas, her face buried in the worn, furry body of a stuffed rabbit. Her small shoulders shook with silent, terrified sobs. She hadn't even looked up at the sound of the explosion. She was simply trying to disappear, to make herself so small that the monster in the room would forget she existed. Mark slowly turned his head, his drunken mind struggling to process the impossible sight before him. He saw a man standing where a door should have been, a man dressed in a suit that cost more than 6 months' rent on this pathetic apartment, a man who radiated an aura of absolute stillness, a calm so profound it was more terrifying than any threat. Mark's own anger, his loud, blustering rage, felt cheap and hollow in the face of this silent, imposing presence. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift. It was annihilated and remade in a single silent second. "Who the hell are you?" Mark's voice was a hoarse whisper, all the drunken fury gone, replaced by a raw animal confusion. He took a half-step back, his bravado evaporating like mist. His knuckles were white where he gripped the bottle, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a crutch. Julian did not answer. Words were unnecessary. He took one step into the room, his shoes crunching softly on the broken glass. His eyes never left Mark's. They were not filled with anger or hatred. They were empty. They were the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. They were the eyes of a man who made decisions about life and death with the same emotional investment as choosing a tie. And in that moment, Mark Jennings, the bully of this small, broken kingdom, understood. He did not know who this man was. He did not know where he came from. But he knew with a certainty that chilled the alcohol in his blood that he was looking at his own end. Julian's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, down to the small girl in the corner. He saw the tattered rabbit clutched in her hands. He saw how she tried to press herself into the wall, and the cold, controlled void inside him solidified into something hard and heavy as granite. He had seen that rabbit before, or one just like it, in a small, silver frame on his desk. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into a thick, syrupy silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and Lily's muffled, helpless crying. Mark's chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths. He was a cornered animal, his mind racing, finding no escape. He looked from the terrifying stranger to the cowering child and back again. The connection clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The phone, the text messages, it was impossible. It was insane, but it was the only explanation. This dark angel of death had been summoned here by a 7-year-old girl. Julian took another step. The room felt suddenly small, the air crackling with unspoken violence. He was a force of nature that had just breached the walls of this fragile, miserable world. Mark's fear began to curdle back into a desperate, stupid rage. He was being challenged in his own home. He was being looked at like he was nothing. He tightened his grip on the bottle, his shoulder muscles tensing. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Julian saw the shift, the tiny tell in the man's eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He saw the decision to fight before it had even fully formed in Mark's liquor-soaked brain, and Julian remained perfectly still, waiting. He let the silence stretch, letting the terror sink deeper into Mark's bones. He wanted him to understand the chasm that separated them. He wanted him to feel the absolute certainty of his own irrelevance. And in the space between one ragged breath and the next, the predator of this tiny, broken home met the apex predator of the entire city. The world had shrunk to the space of a single, ragged breath. For Mark Jennings, reality was a distorted lens of cheap whiskey and sputtering rage. A man stood in the ruin of his doorway, a phantom in a suit too clean for this part of the city. The cold air rushing in felt like a physical blow, sobering him just enough to fuel his fury. He saw the sharp cut of the suit, the glint of expensive shoes on his filthy floor, and it felt like a personal insult. This wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't the police. This was an intrusion of a different order entirely. His brain, sluggish and thick, latched onto the only possible response. Territory, violation. This was his apartment, his rules. He swelled his chest, a pathetic imitation of a predator. The little girl, Lily, was a forgotten detail in the corner of his vision. The locked door behind which her mother wept was just a part of the scenery. All that mattered was the silent, imposing figure who had dared to break his door. "Who the hell are you?" Mark's voice was a gravelly roar, spittle flying from his lips. The words echoed in the small, tense room. It was not a question. It was a challenge, a threat from a man whose only currency was brute force. He didn't wait for an answer. An answer would require thought, and his mind was a storm of pure, unthinking aggression. He lunged. To Julian Croft, the lunge was almost laughably slow. He had seen bullets travel with more grace. He saw the way Mark's weight shifted clumsily onto his front foot. He saw the telegraphed arc of the man's right fist, a wide, sloppy haymaker meant to obliterate, not to fight. The air in the room seemed to thicken, every detail sharpening into perfect focus. The smell of stale beer on Mark's breath, the desperate, silent prayer in the wide eyes of the little girl huddled near the wall, the faint sound of a woman's weeping from behind the locked bedroom door. All these things registered in the space of a heartbeat, not as distractions, but as data points confirming his purpose. He did not move back. He moved in. A simple sidestep, a fluid motion of his left foot took him out of the path of the clumsy punch. Mark's momentum carried him forward, his fists sailing through the empty air where Julian had been a moment before. He stumbled, off balance and confused. The phantom was gone. Before Mark could even begin to turn, Julian's hand struck. It was not a punch. It was a precise, calculated jab with the rigid tips of his fingers. The target was the small, vulnerable hollow at the base of Mark's throat. There was a sickening, wet choking sound as the air was violently expelled from Mark's lungs. The furious roar he was about to unleash died as a strangled gasp. His eyes bulged with shock and sudden, suffocating pain. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't shout. His hands flew to his throat, clawing for air that wasn't there. He was still staggering, trying to process the first attack, when the second one came. Julian's other hand, open and flat, struck the side of Mark's head, just above the ear. It wasn't a slap meant to sting. It was a concussive blow aimed at the temple, a technique designed to disrupt equilibrium and overload the senses. The impact was a dull thud, absorbed completely by the target. Mark's world tilted violently. The room spun in a nauseating blur of peeling wallpaper and dim yellow light. The floor seemed to rush up to meet him. There was no pain from the second hit, only a profound and immediate disconnect. His brain could no longer send signals to his limbs. His legs gave way, folding beneath him like wet paper. He collapsed in a heap, his head hitting the grimy floor with a soft thud. His eyes rolled back into his head, and then there was only darkness. He was unconscious before he fully understood he was being attacked. It took less than 3 seconds. Silence descended upon the room once more, profound and heavy. It was a different kind of silence now. The tense, simmering quiet of before was gone, replaced by the deep stillness of finality. The only sounds were the ragged, shallow breaths of the little girl in the corner and the continued, muffled sobbing from the bedroom. Julian stood over the unmoving form of Mark Jennings. He did not look at him. The man was no longer a threat. He was just an obstacle that had been removed. Julian's heart rate was steady. His breathing was even. There was no flush of victory, no surge of adrenaline. There was only the cold, clean satisfaction of a job done efficiently. He looked down at his hands, turning them over once. They were unmarked. He adjusted the cuff of his dark suit jacket, a small, automatic gesture of restoring order. The fine wool was unruffled. The crease in his trousers was still sharp. He was a surgeon who had just finished a messy but necessary procedure. His gaze then moved, landing on Lily. She was pressed so tightly against the wall she seemed to be trying to merge with it. Her small body was racked with silent tremors. Her stuffed rabbit was crushed against her chest, its one-button eye staring blankly at the scene. But her own eyes, wide and dark with a terror too deep for her years, were fixed on him. She was not looking at the fallen monster on the floor. She was looking at the new one who stood in his place. Julian's expression did not change. His face remained a mask of cold neutrality. He knew that to her, he was just another source of fear, a larger, quieter, and more terrifying version of the man he had just felled. He could see the question in her eyes. Was he here to hurt her too? He offered no reassurance. Words were useless now. Actions were all that mattered. He took a slow, deliberate step away from Mark's body, turning his back on the vanquished man. His attention was now fully on the locked bedroom door. The sound from within had changed. The weeping had subsided into a series of panicked, hitching breaths. The woman inside had heard the scuffle. She had heard the fall. Now she was listening to the silence, and it was likely even more terrifying than the noise had been. Julian walked to the door. His expensive leather shoes made almost no sound on the thin, worn carpet. He reached out and tried the knob. It was locked, as he expected. He examined the lock itself. It was a cheap, flimsy thing. A privacy lock for a bathroom, not a tool of imprisonment. It was pathetic. An insult. He could have kicked this door in as well, but that felt needlessly theatrical now. The grand entrance was over. This was something different. This was an unlocking. He placed his palm flat on the door, just beside the knob. He braced his feet, shifting his weight. He did not draw back for a sudden impact. Instead, he simply began to push. It was a steady, inexorable pressure, the application of immense, controlled force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint cracking sound came from the door frame. The wood around the lock plate began to splinter. The woman inside gave a small, terrified cry. Julian did not stop. He continued to apply pressure, his muscles taut beneath the fine fabric of his suit. The splintering grew louder, a sharp, tearing protest of stressed wood. The cheap metal of the lock groaned, then bent. With a final sharp crack, the entire locking mechanism gave way. The door flew open, swinging inward and banging against the wall inside. The room was small and dark, the only light spilling in from the living room behind him. A single bed was pushed against the far wall, its sheets in disarray. Clothes were scattered on the floor. And huddled in the corner between the bed and the wall was a woman. Sarah Carter looked up, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of pure terror. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess around her shoulders. She wore a long-sleeved shirt, but Julian's eyes immediately caught the faint, yellowing bruise peeking out from her collarbone. She had her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them as if to hold herself together. She had been expecting Mark to burst through the door, his face purple with rage. She had been bracing for the blow she knew would come. Instead, she saw him, a stranger, tall, dark, and utterly terrifying. He stood in the broken doorway like a figure carved from shadow and ice. His suit was immaculate, a stark, impossible contrast to the squalor of her life. His face was unreadable, his gray eyes cold and piercing. They seemed to look right through her, to see every hidden fear, every moment of her private shame. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her mind, already reeling from the sounds of the brief, violent struggle and the deafening silence that followed, simply could not process what she was seeing. This man was not Mark. But what was he? Where had he come from? The questions swirled in her head, a confusing vortex of fear and disbelief. Her gaze darted past him into the living room. From her low angle on the floor, she could see a shape lying motionless on the carpet. A pair of worn jeans, a stained t-shirt. Mark. He wasn't moving. A wave of something dizzying and unfamiliar washed over her. It felt like relief, so potent and sharp it was almost painful. The constant, grinding fear that had been her companion for years suddenly vanished. The knot of dread in her stomach loosened its grip. But as quickly as the relief came, it was swallowed by a new and even greater fear. She looked back at the man in the doorway. He was the one who had made Mark fall. He was the source of the silence. His stillness was more menacing than all of Mark's drunken shouting. Mark was a violent, pathetic man. This person was something else entirely. He radiated a quiet, absolute power that chilled her to the bone. He had appeared from nowhere like a ghost and brought a terrible, swift judgment with him. Sarah stared, trembling, not at her fallen abuser, but at the terrifying, well-dressed stranger who saved her. The silence that followed the violence was the most terrifying thing of all. Sarah Carter stood frozen in the bedroom doorway, her world reduced to a series of fractured images. The splintered frame where the lock used to be. The unconscious form of Mark Jennings sprawled on the thin, stained carpet, Mosham, and the man, the stranger. He stood in the center of the room, a pillar of darkness in a perfectly tailored suit. He had not moved. He simply watched, his presence sucking all the air from the small apartment. The shouting and the breaking glass had been a familiar terror. This quiet, absolute stillness was something new and infinitely more frightening. Her gaze darted from the stranger to her daughter. Lily was still huddled in the corner where Mark had trapped her, a small, trembling bundle of a girl. That sight, the sight of her child alone and terrified, finally broke through Sarah's paralysis. A wave of pure maternal instinct washed over her, powerful enough to drown out her own fear. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud beside her daughter. She didn't speak. Words were useless, impossible. Instead, she wrapped her arms around Lily, pulling the small, shaking body against her own. Lily didn't cry out. She just burrowed into her mother's chest, her small hands clutching a fistful of Sarah's shirt. They clung to each other, a tiny island in a sea of wreckage, their wide, frightened eyes fixed on the man who was the source of both their rescue and their new dread. Julian Croft watched them. The primal heat of the confrontation, the cold, clean mechanics of controlled violence, began to recede. It left behind a hollow ache in his chest, an echo of an old, deep wound. He saw the woman, her face pale and streaked with tears, shielding her child with her own body. He saw the pure, undiluted terror in her eyes, a fear that was not just for herself, but for the life she held in her arms. But his gaze kept being drawn lower to the small object clutched in the little girl's hand. It was a stuffed rabbit, worn and tattered from years of love. Its fur was matted down, one of its ears flopped at a sad angle, and a black button had replaced a lost eye. It was pathetic. It was a ruin of a toy, and it was the most familiar thing he had ever seen. The cold, sterile penthouse, the city lights below, the hum of his criminal enterprise. It all dissolved. For a fraction of a second, he was somewhere else entirely. He was in a small, stuffy room from a lifetime ago. He saw a little girl with dark hair, his sister, hiding under a table. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, its stuffing leaking from a seam in its belly. He remembered the exact feel of its coarse, matted fur under his own small fingers when he had tried to comfort her. He remembered the way she held it, a shield against a world of angry shouts and slamming doors. The memory was not a thought, it was a physical sensation, a ghost of powerlessness that still haunted him on quiet nights. The image on his desk was a polished, silver-framed memory of a happy day. That right here in this squalid apartment was the truth of the fear she had lived with. The rabbit in Lily's hand was not just a toy, it was an anchor to a failure he could never undo. The faint creak of the floorboards behind him pulled him back to the present. He did not need to turn to know who was there. Leo entered first, his face an impassive mask. He was followed by two more of Julian's men, both dressed in the same dark, sharp suits. They moved with a silent, fluid grace that was deeply unsettling in the cramped space. Their eyes took in the entire scene in a single, practiced glance. The shattered door, the woman and child on the floor, the unconscious man, and their boss standing over it all like a silent judge. They did not speak. They did not need to. They were instruments, perfectly tuned to their master's will, and they simply waited for the command. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just one man. It was a pack of them. They looked like they had stepped out of a nightmare, their expensive clothes a shocking contrast to the poverty of her apartment. They had the same cold, detached look as the first man, the same aura of quiet, lethal capability. Her fragile hope of rescue shattered. These were not policemen. These were not heroes. They were something far more dangerous. She tightened her grip on Lily, instinctively trying to make herself bigger, to become a wall of flesh between her daughter and these silent predators. Who were these people? What did they want? The fear of Mark, a known and predictable monster, was suddenly replaced by the absolute terror of the unknown. Julian's gaze remained fixed on Sarah and Lily. He saw the new wave of fear wash over the woman's face as his men entered. He saw her brace for another blow, another kind of violence. Without turning his head, though, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture so minute it was barely a movement at all, but Leo and his men understood it perfectly. Two of the men moved forward, their polished leather shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum. They navigated around the broken coffee table and the overturned lamp with an eerie precision. They did not look at Sarah. They did not acknowledge her or the child she was desperately trying to hide. It was as if they did not exist. One man took Mark by the shoulders, the other by the ankles. With a synchronized, effortless motion, they lifted his limp body from the floor. Mark's head lolled back, his mouth hanging open. He was a sack of dead weight, a problem to be disposed of. They turned and carried him out of the apartment, his dirty sneakers dragging softly across the floor. There was no discussion, no grunt of effort, just a clean, silent, terrifyingly efficient removal. They closed what was left of the door behind them, and the sound of their footsteps faded down the hall. The room was suddenly larger, emptier, but the silence was now heavier, charged with unspoken questions. Leo remained by the doorway, a silent sentinel. The air was thick with the lingering scent of stale beer, old fear, and something else. A crisp, clean fragrance of sandalwood and cold money that clung to the stranger. It was the smell of a different world, a world that had just crashed into hers. Julian finally moved. He took a slow step forward, and Sarah flinched, pulling Lily so tight the little girl let out a small whimper. He stopped. His cold, gray eyes, which had held a storm of violence just minutes before, seemed to soften as they rested on the child. He looked from Lily's frightened face to the tattered rabbit she still clutched as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. He saw the tear tracks on her cheeks, the dirt on her small knees. He then let his gaze drift around the room. He saw the pathetic attempt to make a home here, the faded second-hand furniture, the crayon drawing taped to the wall, a bright yellow sun in a crooked blue sky. He saw the splintered wood of the door he had kicked in, a symbol of the violation this family lived with every single day. He saw the geography of their suffering laid bare. It was a map of helplessness, a map he knew all too well. He had come here driven by a ghost. He had answered a child's plea with the only language he truly commanded, force. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the rage was gone. What remained was a stark and simple clarity. Leaving them here was not an option. Calling the police would only entangle them in a system that was slow, indifferent, and ultimately ineffective. A system that had failed his sister, a system that would undoubtedly fail them too. Mark, or someone like him, would eventually return. The cycle would continue. He looked back at Sarah. Her eyes were wide with a desperate, pleading terror. She was a ship lost in a storm, and he was the unexpected, menacing shore she had crashed upon. She was saved from drowning, only to be stranded in a new and dangerous land. He understood her fear. In her world, men like him were the final nightmare, not the answer to a prayer. His decision was not made with logic or strategy. It was not a business calculation. It was forged in the fire of a decades-old memory, in the reflection of a tattered rabbit. It was a correction, an attempt to balance a scale that had been tipped against him long ago. He could not save the little girl in his memory, but he could save this one. He could rewrite this one ending. He looked from the terrified mother and daughter to the wreckage of the room, to the broken door that had failed to protect them. In the quiet ruin of their lives, Julian Croft saw a space where he could finally build something. Not for profit, not for power, but to silence a ghost. He would take them from this place. He would hide them. He would become the wall that would never, ever break. Julian looked from the terrified family to the wreckage of the room and made a silent, life-altering decision. The air was thick with the dust from the splintered doorframe and the metallic tang of fear. His two men stood by the empty space where the door had been, their large frames blocking the dim hallway light. They were statues of loyalty, their eyes fixed on him, awaiting the next command. The engine of his world, which ran on violence and consequence, had stalled in this small, miserable room. Sarah Carter was a statue of a different kind. She was frozen in place, a shield of her own body wrapped around her daughter. Her knuckles were white where she gripped Lily's small shoulders. Her breaths were shallow, audible gasps in the sudden quiet. She was not looking at the space where Mark had been dragged away. She was looking at Julian. Her eyes, wide and swimming with tears, held a question she was too terrified to ask. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" Julian's gaze dropped to the little girl. Lily was hiding her face in her mother's side, one small hand clutching the worn fabric of her jeans. The other hand held her stuffed rabbit, its single button eye seeming to stare right at him. It was a pathetic, beloved thing. an anchor in a storm. He remembered a small plush bear with both its eyes missing, tucked under the arm of a girl with a bright, fearless smile. His sister. The memory was a physical ache, a phantom limb that chose this moment to throb with life. He took a slow step forward. Sarah flinched, pulling Lily even closer. The movement was so sharp, so instinctual, it was like a blade to his gut. He stopped. He had shattered her prison only to become the new jailer. The thought was unwelcome, but true. He was a monster of a different breed, one who wore a tailored suit and spoke in quiet tones, but a monster nonetheless. He crouched down, a deliberate, slow movement to make himself smaller, less threatening. The expensive fabric of his trousers creased on the dirty floor. He ignored it. He addressed the top of Lily's head, his voice a low murmur, softer than he had used in years. "It's over now," he said. "He won't be coming back. No one will hurt you or your mother again." Lily didn't move, but her trembling seemed to lessen, just a fraction. Sarah's gaze flickered from Julian's face to the empty doorway and back. Hope was a dangerous foreign object in her world, and she did not know how to hold it. Who are you?" she finally whispered. Her voice was raw, broken. Julian looked up at her. Her face was pale, bruised along the jawline where a shadow was already forming. He saw the exhaustion etched into every line around her eyes. She was a soldier who had been fighting a war alone for far too long. "My name is Julian," he said, the name feeling strange on his own tongue in this context. "Right now, that's all that matters. This apartment isn't safe. You can't stay here." He stood up slowly. "Leo," he said, his voice returning to its normal, commanding tone without raising in volume. Leo, his ever-present right hand, stepped into the room. He was holding a clean, folded handkerchief. He offered it to Sarah without a word. She stared at it as if it were a snake. After a long moment, she took it, her fingers brushing his. She dabbed at her eyes, then Lily's, the simple act of care, a small return to normalcy in the chaos. "We're leaving," Julian announced. It was not a question or a suggestion. It was a fact. "Gather anything you need. We don't have much time." Sarah looked around the ruined apartment, the broken lamp, the shattered picture frames, the stale air. What was there to take? Her entire world was clinging to her leg. "My purse," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the bedroom." Leo nodded once and disappeared into the room Julian had opened. He returned a moment later with a worn leather bag and a thin, faded coat. He held the coat out for Sarah. She hesitated, her eyes locked on Julian. Then she allowed him to drape it over her shoulders. The gesture was professional, impersonal, yet it was a kindness so profound in its simple utility that fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Let's go," Julian said, turning towards the door. He didn't wait to see if they were following. He knew they would. They had no other choice. He led the way down the echoing stairwell, the smell of boiled cabbage and damp concrete replacing the tension of the apartment. His men followed behind, a silent rearguard for the small, broken family. The cold night air hit them as they exited the building. It felt clean, washing away the grime of the last hour. Julian's black sedan was parked at the curb, a sleek predator in a street of dying animals. It was so out of place it looked like a hole in reality. One of his men opened the rear door. Julian turned to Sarah. "Get in." She clutched Lily's hand and hurried towards the car, casting one last, terrified look at the apartment building wing. It was her prison, but it was also the only home she had. She slid onto the plush leather seat, pulling Lily in after her. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing them inside. The sounds of the city faded to a dull, distant hum. Julian and Leo got into the front. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, gliding into the sparse traffic. In the rearview mirror, Julian could see the mother and daughter huddled together. Lily was staring out the window, her eyes wide as the drab neighborhood gave way to brighter streets. Sarah was just staring at the back of his head, her reflection a pale, ghostly mask on the darkened glass. The silence inside the car was a living thing. It was composed of Sarah's fear, Lily's shock, and Julian's cold, calculating thoughts. He could feel Leo's unease beside him. This was a deviation from every protocol they had ever followed. This was personal, and in their world, personal was a synonym for vulnerable. After several minutes, Leo broke the silence. His voice was low, meant only for Julian. But in the tomb-like quiet of the car, Sarah heard every word. "I have the preliminary report on Mark Jennings," he said. Julian didn't turn his head. He just watched the city lights paint streaks across the windshield. "And?" "He's a small-time degenerate. Nothing we'd normally notice. But he has debts, significant ones." Leo paused. "He owes nearly 100,000 to the O'Malley crew. Looks like he was skimming from a bookmaking operation they run downtown." Julian's expression didn't change. The O'Malleys were rivals, ambitious, violent, and predictable. This was not a complication. It was a solution, a neat and tidy one. In his world, problems often solved each other if you knew how to position them correctly. "He missed his last 2 payments," Leo continued. "They were actively looking for him, and my sources say their patience had run out." In the back seat, Sarah went rigid. She understood the implications. These were not policemen or bankers. These were people like the man in the front seat, people who dealt in a currency of pain. Julian's reply was simple. It was quiet. It was absolute. Package him up. Deliver him to them. He didn't need to elaborate. He didn't need to specify what that meant. Leo understood perfectly. Mark Jennings was no longer their problem. He would be a gift, a peace offering to a rival crew that cost him nothing and solved an inconvenient situation. Mark Jennings would simply cease to exist. His disappearance would be attributed to his own bad decisions. No loose ends, no connection back to Julian or to the woman and child in his car. "Consider it done," Leo said, his tone clipped and professional. He made a discreet call, his words brief and coded. Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed her hand over Lily's ear, a futile gesture. The man who had saved them had just condemned another man to a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. She had been freed from a cage, only to be locked in a car with the zookeeper of a far more dangerous jungle. The terror she felt for Mark was gone, replaced by a profound, suffocating fear of her rescuer. Her body trembled, and she bit her lip to keep from making a sound. Julian saw the tremor in the rearview mirror. He saw the new wave of fear wash over her face. He had expected it. He wanted her to understand. The world he inhabited was not kind. It was not safe. But for her and for her child, it could be a fortress. After ending his call, Leo turned slightly in his seat. "Julian," he began, his voice even lower now, full of caution. "What's the play here with them?" He gestured his head slightly towards the back seat. "We're not taking them to the penthouse," Julian stated. It was obvious. That was his sanctuary, his command center. It was no place for a child. "You have a list of our holding properties, the quiet ones, the one in Oak Creek by the reservoir. Is it clean?" Leo hesitated. This was the moment for him to object, to be the voice of reason that Julian paid him to be. "It's clean, but Julian, this is a mistake. Bringing civilians this deep, it's a liability. It creates a connection, a weakness. Our enemies, the police, if anyone ever found out, they could use them against you." Leo's logic was flawless. It was the same cold calculus Julian himself would have applied to any other situation. Attachments were anchors. They could drown you. For years, Julian had prided himself on having none. His empire was built on a foundation of emotional detachment. "You're making a strategic error based on an emotional impulse," Leo pressed, his loyalty forcing him to speak the hard truth. "We can give them cash. Set them up in another city. They disappear. We disappear from their lives. That's the clean way. That's the smart way." Julian listened, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Every word Leo said was correct. It was the sensible path, the professional path. It would ensure his own safety and remove the variable. But then his eyes flickered to the mirror again. Lily had finally succumbed to exhaustion. Her head was resting on her mother's lap, her small face peaceful in sleep. Sarah was stroking her hair, her fingers tracing gentle patterns. Her own fear was secondary to her daughter's comfort. He thought of his sister. He thought of the police report. He thought of the words "too late." He had been too late then. A powerless teenager unable to stop the inevitable. He was not powerless now. Giving them money and sending them away was still leaving them to chance. Another Mark Jennings could find them. The world was full of them. "I'm not asking for your opinion on strategy, Leo," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. The temperature in the car seemed to drop several degrees. I'm giving you an order. Prepare the Oak Creek house. Full provisions. Everything they could possibly need. Have a security detail in place by the time we arrive. A discreet one. 2 cars, 4 men. They are not to be seen, but they are to be there. Leo was silent for a long moment. He knew that tone. It was the voice Julian used when a decision was immutable. It was the voice that ended arguments, and sometimes men. He gave a single sharp nod. Understood. He began making the arrangements, his voice a low, efficient hum of commands. Julian drove on, the city's neon glow washing over his impassive face. He was breaking a cardinal rule. He was creating a weakness, just as Leo had said. He was taking this woman and this child and placing them under the shadow of his own dark world. It was selfish, it was dangerous, it was illogical. But as he glanced in the mirror one last time at the sleeping girl and her vigilant mother, he knew it was the only choice he could make. He was not just giving them a safe house for the night. He was taking them under his personal protection, binding their fate to his own. This was no longer just a rescue. It was an adoption into the deadliest family in the city. He had made a promise to a ghost, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. The silence in the car was a foreign country. For Sarah, silence had always been the tense, breathless moment before a storm, the held breath before Mark's key scraped in the lock. This was different. This silence was smooth, thick, and unbroken, woven into the smell of clean leather and the low hum of the engine. She sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. Beside her, Lily was a small, still statue, her face turned to the window, her worn stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest like a shield. They had been taken from the wreckage of their lives by a man who moved with the quiet deadliness of a panther. Now they were being driven to an unknown destination, caught in the undertow of a decision they did not understand. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She kept replaying the scene in the apartment. The splintered door, Mark's unconscious form being dragged away by men in dark suits who never spoke a word. And Julian Croft, the epicenter of the chaos, standing perfectly still. He had not explained anything. He had simply looked at her and Lily, his gray eyes holding an expression she could not name, and said, "You will come with me." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact as undeniable as gravity. So she had grabbed her daughter's hand, her purse, and followed, leaving everything else behind without a second glance. The apartment held nothing for her but ghosts and fear. The car slowed, turning off the main road into a quiet, tree-lined street. The houses here were modest but neat, with small, tidy lawns and darkened windows. It was a world away from the cracked pavement and overflowing dumpsters of their old neighborhood. Leo, the man who had driven them, pulled into the driveway of a small, 2-story house with a welcoming porch light glowing warmly in the dark. He killed the engine, and the silence deepened, now filled only by the sound of Sarah's own breathing. Leo turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. "This is for you," he said, his voice neutral. "For now." He led them to the door, unlocked it, and pushed it open. He gestured for them to enter. "The house is stocked. Anything you need you will find. My number is on the kitchen counter. Use it only for emergencies." Sarah hesitated on the threshold. It felt like a trap, a beautiful, clean, well-lit trap. Lily, however, seemed to feel something else. She tugged on Sarah's hand and took a tentative step inside, her wide eyes taking in the clean, uncluttered living room. Sarah followed, her body tense, expecting a hidden cost, a terrible price that would be demanded later. The air inside smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish. It was warm. Leo placed a single key on a small table by the door. "Lock it behind me," he instructed, his tone professional, detached. He did not wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked back to the car, leaving them alone. Sarah quickly shut the door and turned the lock, the click echoing in the profound quiet. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her legs suddenly weak. Tears she had held back for hours began to stream down her face. They were tears of relief, of confusion, of terror. She had no idea if she was a guest or a prisoner. Lily's small hand found hers. "Mommy," she whispered, "is this our house now?" Sarah knelt and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, burying her face in Lily's hair. "I don't know, baby," she choked out. "I don't know." They stood like that for a long time, two survivors on the shore of a strange new land. Slowly, cautiously, they began to explore. The living room had a soft gray sofa and a thick plush rug. On a coffee table, a remote control sat next to a small stack of children's books. They walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator was full of milk, juice, eggs, and fresh vegetables. The pantry was stocked with pasta, cereal, and canned goods. On the counter next to a brand new coffee maker was a single business card with Leo's name and number, just as he had said. Upstairs there were two bedrooms. One was for her, with a large bed made up with crisp white sheets and a soft blue comforter. In the closet hung a few simple new items of clothing in her size. A pair of jeans, some sweaters, a warm coat. It was unsettlingly thoughtful. The other room was clearly for Lily. The walls were painted a pale, sunny yellow. A small bed was covered in a quilt decorated with cartoon animals. A little wooden desk sat under the window, and a small bookshelf held more picture books. Lily walked in and stopped, her eyes fixed on the bed. She slowly approached it, reached out a tiny hand, and touched the quilt as if to see if it was real. She looked back at Sarah, a fragile, hopeful question in her eyes. Sarah nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "It's for you, sweetie." For the first time in years, Sarah slept through the night. There were no sudden noises, no angry shouts from the next room, no fear of a key turning in the lock. There was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the soft sound of Lily breathing in the next room. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window, feeling a profound sense of dislocation. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the memory of the previous night came rushing back, and the anxiety returned, a cold knot in her stomach. This safety felt conditional, temporary. It belonged to someone else. 3 days passed in this strange, quiet peace. They ate simple meals. Lily read the new books, though she never let her tattered rabbit out of her sight. Sarah found herself cleaning things that were already clean, just to have something to do with her hands. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She expected Julian Croft to appear and lay out his terms, to explain what he wanted in return for this sanctuary. But no one came. No one called. The silence began to feel less like a threat and more like a gift. On the fourth day, as Sarah was making lunch, she saw a familiar black sedan pull into the driveway. Her heart leaped into her throat. Julian Croft was here. She watched from the kitchen window as he got out of the car. He was alone. He wore a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the pale afternoon light. He walked to the front door with the same unhurried, deliberate pace she remembered. He did not knock. He simply waited as if he knew she was watching. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on a dish towel. She told Lily to stay in the kitchen and walked to the door, her stomach churning. She took a deep breath and opened it. Julian stood there, an imposing silhouette against the bright day. His gray eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He was holding a large, elegantly wrapped gift box. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was low and quiet, yet it carried an authority that made it impossible to refuse. Sarah stepped back, holding the door open. He entered, and the peaceful atmosphere of the house immediately shifted, charged with his presence. He was too large, too intense for the small, simple space. He glanced around the living room, his gaze lingering for a second on the children's book Lily had left on the sofa. Lily, drawn by the new voice, peeked around the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened when she saw Julian. She instinctively took a step back, hiding half her body behind the doorframe. Her old rabbit held tight against her chest. Julian's focus shifted to her. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften, just for a fraction of a second. He knelt, an incongruous sight in his expensive suit, bringing himself closer to her level. He held out the gift box. "This is for you," he said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. Lily looked from the box to her mother, seeking permission. Sarah gave a small, hesitant nod. Lily slowly emerged from behind the doorframe and walked towards him. She was wary, like a small animal approaching a potential danger. She took the box from him. It was almost as big as her torso. She sat down on the plush rug and carefully, painstakingly, began to unwrap it. Sarah watched, her breath held. Inside was a large, beautiful teddy bear. It had soft, honey-colored fur, bright, shiny black eyes, and a perfect red ribbon tied around its neck. It was pristine, flawless, a storybook bear. Lily looked at it. She reached out and touched its soft fur. Then she looked down at the old, tattered rabbit in her other hand. Its fur was worn smooth in patches. It had one button eye, and its body was covered in clumsy stitches where Sarah had repaired it over the years. It was a map of their survival, a testament to love in hard times. Lily looked at the perfect new bear, then back at her worn-out rabbit. She gave the new bear a gentle pat on the head, then set it aside. She pulled her old rabbit back into her arms, hugging it tightly. She had made her choice. Julian watched the entire exchange without a word. He did not look disappointed or offended. He simply observed, a strange, thoughtful look on his face. He understood. Comfort could not be bought and delivered in a box. It had to be earned. It had to have history. He slowly stood up, his knees making a soft noise. He turned his attention back to Sarah, who had been watching him, trying to decipher the man behind the fearsome reputation. "He is gone," Julian said quietly. "Mark Jennings. He will not bother you again." The words were delivered with such finality that Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. She did not ask for details. She did not want to know. It was enough that the shadow that had loomed over her life for so long had finally vanished. She wrapped her arms around herself, a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This man, this terrifying, violent man, had given her back her life. He had given Lily a chance at a childhood free from fear. She had to know. She had to ask. The question had been burning in her mind for days. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Why are you doing this? For us? We are nobody." Julian looked at her, and for the first time she saw something beyond the cold control in his eyes. It was a flicker of an old, deep pain, an echo of a wound that had never healed. He glanced over at Lily, who was now quietly showing her old rabbit the new picture books. His gaze returned to Sarah. His answer was simple, stripped of all complexity, yet it held the weight of a lifetime. "Everyone deserves to be safe," he said. The words hung in the air between them, plain and absolute. It was not the whole story she knew, but it was the truth. It was the only reason that mattered. In that moment, the last of her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning trust. He was not a monster. He was a man who knew what it was like to be unsafe, and who had the power to stop it from happening to someone else. He moved toward the door, his visit concluded. He had delivered his gift, given his assurance, and answered her question. His business here was done. Sarah watched him go, her mind reeling. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob, and looked back one last time. As he did, Lily stood up. She walked over to him, her small face serious. She stopped right in front of him and looked up at his towering figure. She was no longer afraid. Then she did something that made Sarah's breath catch in her chest. Lily held up her tattered, one-eyed rabbit. She offered it to him, an offering of the most precious thing she owned, a gesture of pure, unconditional trust. For a long moment, Julian Croft, the ghost of the city's underworld, simply stared down at the small, worn toy held in the hands of a child he had saved. His gloved fingers felt clumsy on the tattered rabbit. The fabric was worn thin, one eye a black button, the other just thread. It smelled of dust in a little girl's bedroom. Lily watched him, her small hands still outstretched from the offering. She was not afraid. In her eyes, he was not the monster that men feared. He was simply the man who came when she called. He carefully handed the rabbit back to her. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, shocking touch of warmth. Lily hugged the rabbit to her chest, a silent understanding passing between them. Weeks later, his car was a silent shadow on a quiet, tree-lined street. He watched Lily run across a green lawn, chasing a yellow butterfly. She stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, then rolled over, giggling. There was no fear in her movements. There was only the pure, unthinking joy of a 7-year-old child. A ghost of a memory surfaced, his own sister, younger than Lily, chasing fireflies in a garden. The old pain was still there, but watching the girl, it felt like a distant, sad echo. The front door of the house opened and Sarah Carter stepped out. The deep, tired shadows under her eyes had faded. She looked rested, confident in a simple summer dress. Seeing his car, she hesitated for only a moment before walking across the lawn. The tinted glass of the passenger window slid down with a soft whisper. The air smelled of cut grass. "Hello, Julian," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. He simply nodded, his eyes still on Lily, who was now attempting a clumsy cartwheel. Sarah followed his gaze. A soft smile touched her lips. "She sleeps through the night now," she said quietly. "The nightmares are fading." She held a simple white ceramic mug in her hands. "I brought you some coffee. I figured you might be here." He took the mug. The warmth seeped through his leather gloves. He did not drink coffee, but that did not matter. The trust in the gesture was monumental. "She started school," Sarah continued, leaning slightly against the car door. "She was nervous, but she made a friend, a little girl named Emma." She paused, her expression turning more serious. "She draws pictures of you." Julian's head turned slowly from the laughing child to the woman beside his car. "She doesn't remember your face," Sarah clarified, sensing his question. "It's more of a shape, a tall, dark shape with bright light behind it. She calls it her guardian angel. She says he came because she asked." A guardian angel, Julian Croft, the ghost of the city's underworld, was an angel in a child's crayon drawing. The irony was a quiet, suffocating blow. He looked down at the coffee mug, then back to Lily. His sister had also been a child in a garden. He had been a boy then, helpless as the world took her. He was not a boy anymore. "She's safe," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, the final closing of a ledger. "Yes," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We both are because of you." She looked at him, her gratitude so immense it was almost a physical force. "I don't think I'll ever understand why you did it, but I will thank you for it every single day." He held the mug out to her. "You should go inside," he said, his voice the same low, measured tone he always used. "Enjoy the sun with your daughter." Sarah nodded, understanding. He was not part of their world. He was its silent protector. She gave him one last look of gratitude and turned, walking back toward her daughter. The window slid up, sealing him back inside his world of silence and leather. He watched for another minute as Sarah sat on the grass and pulled Lily into her lap, pointing up at the sky. He saw Lily's head rest against her mother's shoulder, safe and loved. He put the car in gear. The powerful engine remained a whisper as he pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet suburban street behind. He did not look back. He was returning to the city of shadows, of secrets and power, the world where he was king. But something had changed. The ghost of Julian Croft now carried a small, secret warmth inside him, the sound of a child's laughter on a sunny afternoon.